Hello and welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by War Scholar. We talk about military history from ancient to modern times and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez, and today's guest is Ray Greenberg, who's written about Nobel Prize winners who had the opportunity to do their research because of the Vietnam War. We touch on different aspects of medical and military history. Thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Dr. Raymond Greenberg, author of Medal Winners: How the Vietnam War Launched Nobel Careers, published by the University of Texas Health Press, February 2020. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me.
First, how did you get into studying and writing on this subject?
So my interest in this particular subject was initiated by an article that was published in Science magazine in 2012. The article was written by two Nobel laureates. One of them is named Joseph Goldstein. The other is named Michael. They actually won together. And they wrote in this article about a golden era at the National Institutes of Health. And what they described was a program that existed during that time in which trainees between 1964 and 1972, 9 of them went on to win Nobel Prizes, which is sort of an extraordinary accomplishment.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of piqued my curiosity about this program, which I didn't really know much about prior to their article. And the more I read about it, the more interested I got. I didn't think I could write about all 9 of these Nobel laureates, so it turns out that 4 of them all started at the National Institutes of Health in 1968.
Mm-hmm.
So I chose to focus on those 4, which, by the way, includes both Dr. Goldstein and Dr. Brown, in addition to 2 others. So that was kind of the genesis of my interest in this subject.
Mm-hmm. So let me start by asking about the term yellow beret popped out. I know this book is a mix of a bit of the home front history of the Vietnam War and also about the work they did as medical professionals. But let me focus on this yellow beret idea.
All right. So the program that was involved here, it was because of the Vietnam War, and in fact, it actually goes back to the Korean War. The military needed physicians to provide medical services, and they had a hard time just getting them to volunteer, so there was actually a doctor's draft in place during the Korean War and the Vietnam War. This was kind of a challenging program because a doctor could be recruited essentially directly after graduating from medical school. And so one of the undersecretaries of Defense for Health, a guy by the name of Dr. Frank Berry, created a program in which persons could delay their service so that they could complete more of their medical training. That was an advantage to the military because they would get more experienced physicians. It also provided continuity for the physicians in their training so they wouldn't get called up sort of unexpectedly. And it also provided assurance to the teaching hospitals that they would have doctors to fill their needs until they subsequently went into medical service. Now, one of the sidelights of this doctor draft program was an avenue for providing alternative service to serving in the military. And this was to provide service in the so-called Commissioned Corps of the Public Health Service, of which there were several options that one of these medical graduates could participate in. One of them was to go to the National Institutes of Health, and there they would perform research. They would be trained as researchers. But the reason that they needed physicians in particular was because they also had patients at the clinical center, at the hospital, at the National Institutes of Health, and they needed young physicians to take care of the patients. Another route of alternative service in the Commissioned Corps was to be an epidemic intelligence service officer at the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the 2 most common pathways, but they were both had limited number of slots, and so At the NIH, for example, even in the peak years, they may have had thousands of applicants for about 200 slots. So what happened was that they attracted the very best and brightest out of each medical school class, and they then they did 2 years of clinical training and then came to the National Institutes of Health. Generally for 2 years, some stayed a little bit longer than that. They were referred to as yellow berets, and this was sort of a kind of a joking contrast to the green berets, the special forces of the Army. And it was more generally kind of a derogatory term for draft dodgers. So at the time, some of the so-called yellow berets weren't too happy with the title. But as time went on and after the war, it kind of became sort of a badge of honor to have been selected for this program and to go on. And many of these people became leaders of academic medicine and Nobel Prize winners and so forth. So it became more of a badge of honor over time. But initially it was a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek, perhaps, derogatory term.
So you mentioned that they did get some training prior to service. So was the work they did in the U.S. in their research, was it connected at all to the war effort, or was it just totally whatever they wanted to work on?
Well, they had to be selected by a particular lab at the National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health, at the time, I think there were 8 institutes. There are many more now. But institutes like the National Heart Institute, the National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. So the lab picked the particular kind of a matching program of the applicants and the labs. And based upon where you were selected, determined what kind of research you went on to do. So some of it could have been in heart disease, some of it could have been in cancer. None of it was necessarily related to the war. That was really just sort of a mechanism by which the pool was created. Now, having said that, I should point out that the National Naval Medical Center, it's now Walter Reed Hospital, it sort of changed the name, is located directly across the street from the National Institutes of Health. And so some of the doctors, particularly, for example, in the infectious disease program, where there were not at the time infectious disease specialists at the Naval Hospital, some of the doctors from the National Institutes of Health went over and volunteered to help take care of the wounded warriors who were being brought to Bethesda for various treatment. So, for example, a guy who's in the news a lot these days, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's part of the coronavirus task force, he was in training. He was in the same class, the 1968 class. He was there till 1971 before he left for 1 year and then came back to the National Institutes of Health. And he was providing care to sailors who were being treated at the National Naval Medical Center as a volunteer. It wasn't a requirement. It was just something that they did because they thought that their service could be valuable.
Do you know since Vietnam was obviously a tropical area of conflict, were people coming back with any kind of strange infectious diseases of any type, any tropical diseases that they worked on at the labs or the hospitals?
Well, that's a good question, and it actually, if you go all the way back to World War II, where people were fighting in jungles in Asia, malaria was a big consideration, and in fact, infectious diseases have been, for many conflicts, have been a more difficult problem than battlefield wounds. And so, there's a long history of tropical diseases that have been in areas in which American soldiers have been in conflict, and which have been a source of casualties for those who served there. So Vietnam was just a continuation, really, of what was certainly true in Korea and even back to World War II.
So these individuals were expected to eventually go to Vietnam, correct? This was just kind of a reprieve, or was this complete instead of?
Yeah, it was a complete alternative for their service. So they if they had been drafted, they would have had a 2-year obligation in the military. Not everybody who was drafted as a medical personnel went to Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Many of them were stationed in the United States and stationed in Europe, and as well as in Asia. So even if you had been drafted, it didn't necessarily mean that you were going to be in country in Vietnam. But all 4 of these fellows that I've written about, after they finished at the National Institutes of Health, they all went on to careers at universities and spent the entire rest of their careers at the university. So the only time they were really in government service was the 2 years in which they were in training at the National Institutes of Health.
I'm speaking with Raymond Greenberg, author of Medal Winners. You can find more information on the University of Texas Press website. Please rate this podcast on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. These ratings go a long way in increasing my listenership. Please sign up for my book recommendation newsletter at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. Please post your comments about this podcast or this episode on Facebook at War Scholar or on YouTube at War Scholar 1945. You can contact me directly on Twitter at War Scholar or on Instagram at Chris Alvarez War Scholar. If you're interested in other kinds of history, such as film, TV, books, and comic books history, including science fiction, fantasy, and horror themes, or the history of outer space exploration, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. Now, one thing I noticed in skimming through the book was that it noted that this was a golden age of physicians doing academic research, and it came about because of this, military program. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. It was in some ways, maybe it's a bad metaphor, but it was kind of the perfect storm in some ways. The National Institutes of Health at the time had a probably as large or larger concentration of research experts. I mean, people who were top-notch basic scientists who became the mentors to these trainees, including one of them that was a mentor to one of the 4 future Nobel laureates, won the Nobel Prize himself that year, 1968, Dr. Marshall Nirenberg, who won it. He was involved in decoding the genetic code, figuring out how the nucleic acids of DNA ultimately get converted as templates for forming the proteins in our body, and figuring out how to map one to the other was what he was a co-winner of the Nobel Prize for. So there were amazing mentors for these scientists. That's number one. Number two, because it was so competitive to get into this program, they really had the cream of the crop to choose from. And so many of these guys, there's sort of your standard kind of myth about great scientists is they've known they want to do this since they were 5 years old, and they've always been students of science and math. Well, it turns out that the 4 fellows that I wrote about, some of them, till the time they got to NIH, never had really considered research as a career. And by this time, they were, on average, I guess, about 28 years old. So they were kind of latecomers to research as a career, but they were all very smart, very talented people. They were then exposed to these great mentors. And then I think that the third factor is where science was at that time. Mm-hmm. It was really the beginning of the genetic revolution. As I mentioned, just a few years earlier, the gene code had been broken. And so people were beginning to do all sorts of interesting work on genes and gene control of processes. And so it was an amazing time in science, and it was an amazing selection of individuals that were brought together. Mm-hmm. What's happened now is that some of the universities across the country have developed strong research programs that you don't have today the same concentration of in one facility. It's more distributed around the country, and so while there's still is great science going on at the NIH, and the NIH is a funder of research that goes on at universities, it's not all concentrated today in the same way that it was 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting with all the problems that come with the draft. It also seems to have had some interesting positive side effects. One, the diversity of people who are drafted. You end up with great writers who come out of, with war experiences, and artists and filmmakers. And it's also interesting that we have this situation where the draft created a concentration of minds and intellectual power at NIH.
Right, and I don't think anybody envisioned at the time that's what the outcome of this would be. I mean, they were basically trying to meet a current need, which was they had to staff the hospital, and they needed a pool of people to come in and work in the laboratories there. I don't think anyone had the foresight to imagine that they would be effectively training the next generation of great researchers, and all of the advances that would go on in medicine related to that. I mean, two of the Dr. Goldstein and Dr. Brown, their Nobel Prize-winning work was related to understanding how LDL cholesterol moves into cells in the liver so that it can be broken down and incorporated into various bodily processes. That discovery of how that works led to, not through their work, but extensions of their work, through the development of the so-called statin drugs, which have been major advances in preventing heart disease and the complications of heart disease.
Mm.
The work that was done by Dr. Varmus and his colleague that led to their Nobel Prize had to do with how genes can be involved in cancer causation, and that has now become a major underpinning of the causation of a large number of different cancers. So if you look at the discoveries that were made and the impact it's had on science and health, almost unimaginable that it all started from this relatively short period of time during the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm. Was there anything that happened during the war or anything the DoD did while they were at the NIH that impacted their work, or was it once they were in the NIH, it was all, any military impact was just out there, external to what they were doing?
Yeah, none of them were doing work that was either directly or indirectly related to military needs. Now, some of them have gone on, not before that I wrote about, but Dr. Fauci, who was in their same group and was an infectious disease specialist when the anthrax mailings took place after 9/11. And then there was a great concern at the time about bioterrorism and the use of biological agents for terroristic purposes. He was one of the leaders of developing programs to address that. So while his research, while he was there, didn't have anything to do with military or anti-terrorist activities, he went on to become the director of that institute, and that was a major, still continues to be, but was it certainly in 2002 to 2005 was a major thrust of research that took place there. So not directly in terms of military related, but certainly indirectly you could see how applications came down the pike years later.
And I'm also wondering, sort of on a personal level, and maybe this is outside the scope of your research, but they had colleagues, I'm sure they had colleagues who actually ended up going and being in the military, and also, protests and stuff during this time period in the city in D.C. I'm curious, did you come across any personal impacts on these individuals because of that, because of the war, how the war was affecting others?
Not really in my discussions with them. I think they, of course, they had classmates, many classmates that went to serve, and I don't know to what extent they kept in touch with them afterwards. Mm-hmm. You know, after the Vietnam War, I guess a relevant question to this is you know, why we've had continuing conflict and we medical care. Why isn't the doctor draft still in place? And that's because alternative pathways were subsequently created. By the time I got to medical school in 1976, one of the things that the military did was create scholarship programs so that students could attend medical school essentially free and even got stipends. And then they had a payback commitment when they graduated. So, you know, I had one of my classmates was a West Point graduate. He had been the quarterback of the football team when he was there, and he was on a military scholarship. There were probably, I don't know the exact number, but I would guess maybe 8 to 10 of my classmates that were on support. And then the other thing that subsequently got created is the military created its own medical school, the Uniform Services Medical School. And so there's been a different pipeline over time of bringing physicians and other healthcare professionals in to serve the military's needs. So over time, this issue of the need for a doctor draft and doctors in general being expected to serve has really diminished.
Mm-hmm. Are there other themes or issues in the book? Again, it's a large portion of it is devoted to their actual research. Are there any other themes or issues in there that you'd like to point out before we switch to how you did your research?
Sure. So the book is really divided essentially into 3 parts. One is the pre-NIH years. One is the time that they spent at NIH, which is a big section, the middle section of the book, because it talks about the mentors, the senior scientists who trained them in their work, as well as the work that the trainees did. And then it talks, the last third of the book talks about their Nobel Prize winning work. So I guess to go back to a comment that I made earlier, one of the things that was a little bit of a surprise to me, having spent my whole life in academic medicine and knowing a lot of very smart scientists, it was still a surprise to me that all 4 of these future Nobel laureates were either writers or editors of either their school yearbook or newspaper in high school and or college. And one of them, in fact, started graduate school as an English literature major at Harvard, Echo Dartmouth, decided that was ultimately not what he wanted to do, so he left that program and went to medical school. But I think, you know, we have in our mind that people are either quantitative or non-quantitative kinds of people, and that scientists all come out of this kind of standard cut cloth of being the very quantitative, very science-oriented. And these guys, as I said, only one of them had really done research, another one a little bit of research before they got there, but it really was, they were latecomers to discovering that whole interest and ability in their lives. And so I think there are important lessons to young people about the value of a liberal arts education and reading and writing broadly before you get into a very technical area. And you know, they would argue that it helped them be better writers, better communicators of their science for the years that they spent doing that. So that's just one of the things that to me was kind of an interesting surprise that was unexpected when I first got into the project.
Mm-hmm. I have a question. It actually is outside of the scope of the book, but do you happen to know what medical advances came about because of the war, like stuff that was worked on and learned in the area of combat?
well, it's certainly not an area of my personal expertise, but I think one of the big advances in Vietnam versus prior conflicts was quick evacuation of wounded soldiers and getting them to treatment as quickly as possible. It's nothing like it is today, but getting field evacuation and the trauma care that was provided really advanced during the period of the Vietnam War. There are probably many other advances, but that was one of the things that I think was a byproduct of, and has improved and saved the lives of countless soldiers afterwards, as they've gotten much better at the acute field management of serious injuries.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's turn towards what you did for the research of this book. It sounds like you did some interviews, and what else did you do?
The primary information gathering was through interviews. I knew the 4 Nobel laureates to some extent before I got into the project, met them in different contexts. They were all enthusiastic to be interviewed and to participate. There are also 2 of their mentors are still alive. 2 are deceased, but 2 are still alive, and I interviewed them, as well as probably a dozen or so other people that I knew of who started in the program at the same time. So interviewing was kind of one block of data gathering. One great asset for me as a writer was that the National Institutes of Health has an Office of History, and they have collected, others before me had done interviews of people who had gone through the program. So there is a great repository that's available online of interviews and other materials related to the program. No book had ever been written, but there were a few articles that had been published in scientific journals about it, and so those materials were available. And then probably the greatest time of research was spent trying to educate myself on the research that they did, not only while they were at NIH, but then their Nobel Prize-winning research. Mm-hmm. It was not an area of my own personal expertise in any one of these, and so I really had to teach myself if I was going to write about it, and so it was quite a learning experience for me.
I'm curious, at what point, as they were receiving their medals, their Nobel Prize medals, at what point did it really strike people that, that these individuals had research together, and when did it really strike people of this nexus? Right.
So the first 2 to win the Nobel Prize were Brown and Goldstein, who won it together. Mm-hmm. That was in 1985. So it is a long time after they trained. They trained and started in 68 and were there to 70, 71. Mm-hmm. So, it's a quarter century after they trained, but it was actually, they started their research together in about 1972. And then they're still working together. It's unbelievable. These gentlemen are now close to 80 years old. They still go in before coronavirus. They went into the lab every day and continued to work together. It's the longest sustained relationship, scientific relationship, I believe, in history, because it's a quarter century old. But at any rate, it was even for them, it was 15 years after they were in their training. And then the next one who won was Barmas and his partner Bishop, who was also trained in the program. They were at the University of California, San Francisco, a few years after that. And then the last one who won, the 4th one, Dr. Lefkowitz at Duke University, he did not win until 2000, I want to say 15. I may have the year wrong, but his was actually a more typical delay. It often takes decades after someone's work before it's recognized. So it was only around the time that Lefkowitz won it that people were sort of putting it together that, wow, they were publishing about this. there are 9 of these guys in 8-year span of time that went on ultimately to win Nobel Prizes, which is just kind of a phenomenal batting average.
I'm speaking with Raymond Greenberg, author of Medal Winners. You can find more information on the University of Texas Press website. Please rate this podcast on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. These ratings go a long way in increasing my listenership. Please sign up for my book recommendation newsletter at warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. Please post your comments about this podcast or this episode on Facebook at War Scholar or on YouTube at War Scholar 1945. You can contact me directly on Twitter at War Scholar or on Instagram at Chris Alvarez War Scholar. If you're interested in other kinds of history, such as film, TV, books, and comic books history, including science fiction, fantasy, and horror themes, or the history of outer space exploration, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. Do you know if, when the war was winding up and, the draft was stopped, there was a lot of national anger and frustration about the military. Did that extend to national institutions such as the NIH, or, did the NIH experience maybe a morale or funding drop off after the war, or what happened?
So that's a great question. During the war, there were a few protests on campus about the war, and some of those were well-attended protests. Scientists in general, university people in general, may be a little bit left to center, and so I think that in general, the group was kind of opposed to the war. Not all of them were very active in terms of protests and so forth, mostly because during the war, they were either in their clinical training or in their research training, so they were very preoccupied with that. But one of the mentors, a guy by the name of Jesse Roth, was involved in a group of physicians who provided services for the protests that took place in Washington and people that were rioting that took place after the Martin Luther King assassination in 1968. They provided medical care to people who were imprisoned. So there were people who were doing a variety of kinds of outreach during the war. When the war ended, I thought you were going in another direction with your question. When the war ended, the applications to this program, and there was no longer a physician draft, the applications to this program plummeted. So the peace was signed in 73. By 74, already a fifth of the positions couldn't be filled anymore. But not only did they not have the huge surplus of applicants that they'd had before, they couldn't even fill the number of positions the year after the war ended. And then it subsequently declined. And one of the sad parts of this is that it's been harder and harder over time to attract physicians into research careers. And it's sort of continually dropped off. This was one of the programs that attracted people in fairly great numbers. Now there are MD, PhD programs at many medical schools around the country, and the National Institutes of Health provides training grants for those. So there are other vehicles that are used to attract physicians into research careers, but for a variety of complicated reasons, there are many fewer physicians going into research careers these days, which is probably a great loss.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned the Uniformed Health Services School. Does that have a fair amount of applicants, or does the whole military service thing scare away many potential doctors or applicants from that system? Do you know?
Well, again, I'm not an expert in it, but my sense is that they have done very well in terms of the applicant pool for those spots. Part of it is the scholarships that are available. So, one of the big barriers to medical school today is just the cost of medical education. Even at state-supported universities has gotten very expensive. So the amount of debt someone graduates with these days could be quite large. So to be able to go at limited expense, have training positions already set up for you is a really attractive option. So I think they've had very good success. I mean, the other issue is that many people who go into military medical careers today are, because certainly our military has been in conflicts, but not in the kinds of numbers that you would have during, say, a Vietnam War or a Korean War. So they're much less likely to be in the field, and if they are in the field, they're more likely to be at a referral hospital, let's say in Germany or somewhere where people are transported out of the Middle East or wherever. So it's the danger, the hazard associated with it. I don't want to diminish that there are still people that are, close to the front lines, but not in the kinds of numbers that you would have had during the Vietnam War or the Korean War. So from that perspective, I think it's a reasonably attractive option, and the military school has done very well, I think, in attracting high-quality students.
Mm-hmm. Do you know, did the NIH, during the time of the Vietnam War, did it also have foreign doctors doing research, applying and getting in? Did these individuals interact with foreign scientists?
Yes. Now that has actually become more over time. The number of foreign physicians coming for training, because there isn't as deep a pool of American physicians coming for training, that some of those slots have been taken by foreign medical graduates coming from Europe and Asia and wherever else. Mm-hmm. But even at the time, half century ago, the NIH, because it had a worldwide reputation, attracted very talented young researchers from around the world. And even some of the senior staff came from abroad. So it was always a beacon that attracted really talented people. But it's even more so now that you see a lot of foreign trainees there, as you see in graduate programs in the biomedical sciences around the country.
Mm-hmm. Do you know, at this time of the Vietnam War, did the NIH bring in any Vietnamese scientists as part of any kind of cultural or goodwill exchange while the war was going on? Do you know?
That's a great question. I honestly don't know the answer to that. I'm not aware of such a program. I think the reality was that Vietnam at the time just didn't have that kind of sophisticated research-oriented healthcare system. But the truth of the matter is I really don't know. There may have been some programs that brought some medical personnel, it's not to the NIH, perhaps to train with American physicians in the military.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was just kind of a side question that popped in my mind. I was curious about.
It's a good question.
What part of the research did you find most enjoyable?
I think I would say the interviewing part with the Nobel laureates and their mentors. Some of them were great storytellers, and I just never seen that side of them. Hearing them talk about their youth, talking about the sort of esprit de corps at the NIH, kind of really opened up and was really enjoyable. So I think that the personal interaction piece of it was probably the most personally rewarding part.
Did you get any sense that there was maybe ambivalent feelings that it took the Vietnam War to sort of lead to these outcomes, these positive outcomes, or was it just, what impression did you get?
Are you saying from the Nobel laureates themselves,
yes,
or from others?
Yes.
It's a little hard for me to speak for them. I think they all feel, looking back on it, as they were very fortunate, number one, to be selected, and number two, to be exposed to the people that they were exposed to. I think that's kind of the overriding feeling about it. Mm-hmm. And also that they could do something that would help advance their career and, sort of set them up for future success. Mm-hmm. I expected them to talk a little bit more about their personal feelings about the war. That was, I guess, as I said earlier, they were so focused on what they were doing whether that was when they graduated medical school in 1966, when the war was really ramping up. As they graduated medical school and went into their clinical training, they were what we call house officers, resident physicians, for 2 years during that steep escalation period. By the time they went to NIH, it was pretty much the peak of the war, and then they were, suddenly trying to learn how to do research. So it's almost as if this could be taken in an uncomplimentary way, and I don't mean it that way, but they were almost in an island focused on their immediate work and less so on what was happening in the world around them. Not that they weren't aware of it, they were working hard at what they were assigned to do, and weren't as engaged as others might have been in whether it's the war or protesting the war or whatever. They were very focused on their clinical responsibilities and their research responsibilities.
Yeah. And I wouldn't insist that they, do something in terms of the war. The stuff they were doing was obviously important. But it also makes me think how often, when people write history or present history, say World War II or Vietnam, it's almost presented as though the whole world were caught up in the stresses of the moment, and they forget that the wars are actually a small part of overall society, and plenty of people are going along doing business, science, raising families, whatever you have. So, I was just...
Yeah, and exactly, and I think, kind of the idea behind my book was, for all the negative feelings that people have about the Vietnam War, perhaps some good things, whether planned or unplanned, came out of it that people don't even realize wouldn't have happened if the war hadn't taken place. And so I absolutely agree with you. I think, when you look back, whether it's nostalgically or with angst about those years, there was people had lives to live, and they were doing other things, and those things sometimes led to really important outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Was there a question that was particularly difficult for you to come to a conclusion on, or you still don't feel like you have a good answer at any part of the research you did for the book?
Not really directly. I think that trying to understand what makes an institution at its peak, and it's, again, not to say that the National Institutes of Health is not today a great institution. It certainly is. Mm. But if you sort of thought of that as the golden era, there were some things, policies that were in place at the National Institutes of Health that maybe attracted a broader range of people than universities were at that time and earlier. So, for example, one example is one of the mentors and his wife were both scientists. When they finished both got their PhDs and wanted to find jobs at universities at the time, they would not hire a husband and wife because of nepotism rules. Now, today, two-career families are almost the norm rather than the exception. So you couldn't even imagine this. But at the time, the National Institutes of Health didn't have any restrictions on this. So this guy Stockman, who was a famous biochemist, and his wife were both attracted to come to the NIH because basically the doors were closed at universities to them. To some extent, that was also true of Jewish scientists. There were the quotas at universities were beginning to be taken away. A lot of the well-known research universities, the welcome mat was not laid out to the Jewish students and Jewish faculty, and so there was a pretty high concentration of Jewish scientists at the NIH at that time, where there was no such restriction. I'd like to say the same thing was true for women and for ethnic minorities, but that actually came later. Bernadine Healy, who was the first woman director of the NIH, came in as a trainee in this program a few years later, towards the end of the Vietnam War. But she was a real exception. There were very, very few women at the time who were admitted. So it's kind of culturally, in some ways, ahead of its time. And because it had a little bit more open door policy, it might have attracted some people that it might not otherwise have been able to recruit. And that was part of the talent pool and the atmosphere that made it a very special place at the time.
This question, again, might be a little bit outside the scope of the book, but so what's the purpose of, if you have other research institution, what's the purpose of a National Institute of Health? Why create something like that?
Oh, it's a very good question. So at the time it was created, there weren't the depth and breadth of research labs and institutes across the country in research universities. And the growth of the NIH has roots that go back to the early part of the 20th century or before. But the growth period, it exploded in federal funding after World War II. And part of that had to do with the fact that during World War II, this goes to an earlier question that you asked about the Vietnam War, but during World War II was really the first time that the federal government said, we need to put our scientists to work on helping figure out how we can have an advantage in the field of combat. And of course, probably the most famous example of that is the Manhattan Project. But in other areas of research, non-physics areas of research, the federal government became, during World War II, a major funder of biomedical research. And, of course, they were interested in topics that related to the military. So during World War II, there was concern that the Germans were developing hormonal treatments that would make their aviators able to fly at higher altitudes. And so the number one funding priority during World War II was for hormonal research. The number two priority, and we talked about a little earlier, was malaria research, because of the troops that had to go into Southeast Asia and were exposed to malaria, and also in North Africa. And then after the war, or as the war was ending, the guy that had been put in charge of this, Vannevar Bush, was asked to write a report on the future of science in the United States. And again, as we entered the Cold War, there was this feeling that the federal government needed to invest heavily in research. And that became the genesis for a lot of the funding that came through the federal government to support research. Before World War II, most of the research that was done in this country was funded either from private sources, either philanthropy, or from private industry. After World War II, it dramatically shifted to the federal government becoming the major funder of particularly basic research. So the NIH was kind of riding those coattails, and then as the institutes proliferated, the politics of it, somebody knows somebody who has cancer or a stroke or heart disease, and they want to fund research, support that. So on both sides of the political aisle, it has changed. It's gone up and down over time, but in general, the National Institutes of Health has been a very popular funding source for Congress, because they all value the medical research that comes out of it.
Mm-hmm. I'm constantly amazed at how much war has helped develop science and medicine throughout the ages. It has prompted the development and advancement.
Yeah, I'm sure it goes farther back than World War II, but World War II was really a major turning point in this country and other countries, recognizing that this kind of the birth of smart warfare, and of course it's taken a whole other level today. But it's been both good for the military in terms of improving its effectiveness, and it's also been good for science in terms of all the spin-offs that have come from it.
Interesting. So what do you hope? So I understand the book is designed to provide, historical information and information on this research. But what else do you hope the book will do for readers?
Well, it depends a little bit on the group that we're talking about. Certainly one group that I hope to reach is young people who are considering careers in research, or maybe who hadn't even considered the possibility of a research career. I think realizing that because you didn't think about it since you were 6 years old doesn't mean that you're too late to get into the game. And so I think science is a little biased from my own experience. I think science is a fascinating career, and I hope that it makes it appealing to young people, particularly those who are interested in medicine. That I'd love to see, instead of it being 1% of the physicians who go into research, if we could just double that to 2%, that would be fantastic. Because I think, what we're seeing play out right now with coronavirus, while there are many other ways that physicians can serve our country, and there are many other kinds of scientists other than physician scientists, the people who are really leading this effort right now are all physician scientists. Some whose training goes all the way back to this period that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be a tragic loss for this country and for the world if we couldn't attract physicians into research careers. So I hope that audience, the young people who might be thinking about what they might want to do with their lives, I hope that there is an appeal there. I think people who are interested in biography, who are interested in science, part of this in some ways is how biomedicine changed in the second half of the 20th century. The whole revolution of science was kind of born in this period, and these guys were major contributors to it. People who are interested in great human achievement, winning a Nobel Prize, they're obviously, in each of the specified areas of the Nobel Prize, there can't be more than 3 recipients a year out of the whole world, so it's a very select group of people. But all of them would say that they were good fortune to be at the right place at the right time and choose good topics and have good mentors. And I think a lot of that has to translates into experience beyond scientific research. It's kind of a sort of a code to how to be successful in life, is taking advantage of opportunities as they present themselves, being open to possibilities, finding good mentors. It's not just the pathway to a Nobel Prize, it's the pathway to some a lot of things. So I'm hoping it will appeal to a variety of different audiences.
I think a lot of times the general public might think of doctors as always sort of doing research to some extent, that they're always presenting papers, gathering data, learning, bringing together data on patients. But obviously there's a big gulf between an MD and an MD PhD. I don't know if gulf is the right word. How would you say, what do you think? What is the big difference between just being an MD presenting papers and such and an MD PhD?
Well, an MD PhD, having gotten the PhD means that you've had general, it can vary on the program, but somewhere probably 3 to 6 or 7 years of very focused technical research. So they're more likely to be in the very basic, fundamental, laboratory-based sciences, whereas an MD without that kind of training, while they still could do that kind of work, they're more likely to be in what we might call applied research, where they're doing more work that's related to patient care and collecting information in the course of taking care of patients and then analyzing that. But, I think what's happened with medicine over the last 20 years or more is that there's so much pressure on being efficient, and accountability for time. And research generally is not paid for by insurance companies and the other payers for healthcare. So it's become harder and harder for the average physician to be involved in medical research. Some people do it on the side. Some people are just they find it, even though it's hard and they may not be compensated much, if at all, for the time that they're doing it. Intellectually, they want to be engaged in it. But it's just become very, very difficult in today's very business-oriented environment of medicine for someone to do anything other than pure clinical care.
Mm-hmm.
So it really depends on the context that somebody's in. But the reality is that, as I said, only 1% of physicians today identify research as their primary area of interest. And I don't know that it needs to be more than a few percent, but at the time these guys trained, it was 3% of physicians. So it's now a third of what it was just a few decades ago.
Did you have any difficulties getting the book finished or published?
Well, at the time I was at the University of Texas Central Administration,
mm-hmm.
and so I had the advantage of being able to know and work with the people who work at the University of Texas Press. So that was a great asset. I have another book that's coming out in a few months that the UT Health Press was also the publisher of,
mm-hmm.
which is a biography of someone at one of the institutions there who was a major figure in academic medicine over the last 50 years. But what I have discovered is that the publishing world today is very challenging in terms of the commercial publishers and even the academic presses. The academic presses are sadly being forced to cut way back on the number of offerings, and so many people are going the route of self-publishing today. It's a lot easier than it used to be to self-publish a book, and so that's becoming a much more respectable pathway for publication, and learning how to navigate that. My publishing books before this was a textbook, and that people came to me, and it's now in its 5th edition, and that was almost too easy. It kind of spoiled me in a way for writing. When you're doing medical history and biography, it's a different kind of market, and it's more challenging.
Mm-hmm. Where can people find you on the web? Do you or follow your thoughts? Do you have a web page or social media?
Well, I'm in the process of getting a web page up. Having been an academic my whole life, I've not been sort of into self-promotion, but I'm discovering in the literary world you have to do that, so I'm getting into that. But also just going to the University of Texas Press, there's information about medal winners, and the book that's be forthcoming in a few months is called Donald Selden, the Maestro of Medicine, and I don't think there's anything online yet, but it's part of their fall catalog, so it will be out fairly soon.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, I think you've covered a tremendous amount. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for speaking with me.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can find more podcasts like this on your favorite podcast feed under the title Military History Inside Out. That includes Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. One great way to support me is to rate my podcasts, either good or bad. You can find more great military history information at warscholar.org, on YouTube at Warscholar 1945, on Facebook at Warscholar, on Instagram at Chris Alvarez Warscholar, and on Twitter at Warscholar. Please support me by following me on those sites and liking my videos. If you like to read, don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter where I recommend newly published books. The subscription box is on my webpage. Thank you.